Chapter 1. The Spark. The pavement was still radiating the brutal heat of the afternoon sun when the blood hit it, sizzling briefly before soaking into the porous concrete. Rodney McKnight, a black teenager with a smile that could light up a whole city block, was 17 years old, a kid with his whole life ahead of him. He was holding a silver cell phone, trying to record an encounter he sensed was going south, but the officers, hyped on adrenaline and bias, swore it was a chrome .45. Within seconds, 3 shots rang out, and the light went out of Rodney's eyes. 2 blocks away, in a separate but equally tragic twist of fate, Jerry Geeks, a white man known for his quiet demeanor, was face down in a driveway. He had been coming home from work when police mistook him for a fugitive murder suspect simply because he wore the same color shirt. They didn't ask questions, they just opened fire. 2 families were shattered in a single hour, their grief becoming the twin engines of a city's destruction. By sunset, the air didn't smell like summer anymore. It smelled like copper and spent gunpowder. The sirens weren't just passing through, they were circling like vultures, their blue and red lights dancing off the smoke rising from the first few fires. On 5th Street, the tension snapped. A heavy trash soared through the air, shattering a cruiser's windshield with a thunderous crack. It wasn't just a protest, it was a physical manifestation of a city's collective enough. The police didn't de-escalate. They gassed the neighborhood, firing canisters that hissed like snakes. They pushed mourning mothers back into their own homes with plexiglass shields, shouting orders at people who had just lost their children. The lines were drawn in the soot. Chapter 2. The Station Retreat. Back it up. Fall back to the precinct. The sergeant screamed into his radio, his voice cracking over the sound of breaking glass and distant explosions. The line was breaking. It wasn't just rocks anymore. Bricks, Molotov cocktails, and the weight of sheer human rage were raining down on the front lines. The officers, once seen as an immovable wall, were stumbling over their own equipment as they beat a frantic retreat. For the first time in 30 years, the precinct felt like a cage instead of a fortress. They bolted the heavy steel doors and watched the monitors with wide, sweating eyes. Inside the station, the air was thick with the smell of ozone, sweat, and unadulterated fear. The officers watched the high-definition feeds from the street cameras. The black community was burning, but the fire wasn't staying contained. It was jumping blocks, feeding on the dry rot of systemic neglect. Smoke choked the skyline, turning the moon into a bloody orb. "Let them burn their own shit," one rookie muttered, wiping soot and tears from his forehead, trying to find comfort in his own prejudice. But he was fundamentally wrong. The people weren't just burning shops out of blind anger. They were clearing the path. They were tearing down the obstacles that stood between them and the people who actually held the power. The rage was evolving, becoming tactical, and the precinct was just a stop along the way. Chapter 3. The Pivot. In the heart of the thickest smoke, a man named Marcus stood on top of a charred sedan, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of a nearby fire. "Stop!" he roared, his voice cutting through the cacophony of sirens and shouting. "Stop burning the grocery stores. Stop burning the pharmacies. You're starving your own mothers. You're hurting the people who are already hurting." He looked down at the crowd, his face a mask of grim determination. The crowd jeered at first, fueled by the intoxicating high of destruction, but Marcus didn't flinch. He raised his hands, commanding their attention. "You want to hit something? Hit the shit that actually protects them. Hit the systems that pay for the bullets that killed Rodney and Jerry. If we burn our own blocks, we're doing their work for them." A young man with a bandana over his face looked up, his eyes bloodshot and stinging from the lingering tear gas. "I'm tired of this bitch-ass cycle," he spat. "Every few years, we march, we cry, and they keep shooting. I'm ready to die about this today. If we're going down, we aren't going down holding a sign for a photo op. We're going down holding a line." The crowd went silent, the flickering firelight reflecting in thousands of eyes. The anger changed shape. It went from a chaotic wildfire to a focused surgical laser. They turned their backs on the local shops and turned their faces toward the downtown high-rises. Chapter 4. The Town Hall. While the west side was burning with the fires of the initial uprising, the south side met. It was a sterile, brightly lit community center filled with white professionals, lawyers, and teachers. They were horrified by the death of Jerry Geeks, one of their own, and shaken by the death of Rodney. They were trying to draft a petition, trying to go the legal way, believing that the systems they had trusted all their lives would finally listen if the language was polite enough. Suddenly, the heavy double doors burst open with a crash. 6 officers in full tactical gear, looking more like soldiers than civil servants, stormed the room. Meeting's over. Unlawful assembly, the lead officer barked, his hand hovering over his sidearm. The room went cold. An older man named Arthur stood up slowly. He was a retired professor, a man who had spent 40 years teaching the Constitution and believed in the power of the word. "This is a private meeting, Sergeant," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "Fuck you and your orders. We are discussing the murders of citizens in our own town. We have a right to be here." The sergeant didn't argue. He didn't debate the law or explain his presence. He walked right up to Arthur, his boots clicking on the linoleum. "Say it again, boy," he hissed, using the slur as a weapon of infantilization. "I am not your boy," Arthur began, his chest puffed out in a final display of dignity. Before the sentence could even finish, a heavy wooden baton cracked across his temple. The live stream of the meeting was still running on a dozen phones. The world watched in real time as a peaceful, elderly man was pulverized in high definition. The South Side's faith in the legal way died on that floor along with Arthur's consciousness. Chapter 5: The Fusion. The footage of Arthur's beating hit the phones of the people on 5th Street like a bolt of lightning. The screams of Rodney's mother played over the silent, brutal footage of the town hall raid. The psychological barrier that had kept the two communities apart for generations finally broke under the weight of shared victimhood. "They're killing everyone now," someone shouted in the crowd, the voice echoing through the canyons of the city. "White, black, it doesn't matter if you're peaceful or loud. If you aren't one of them, you're just a target." The two crowds, one coming from the west side, the other from the south, met at the massive bridge leading downtown. It was a staggering sea of faces. Every shade of anger and every social class was represented. No one was saying, "Hands up, don't shoot," anymore. Those words felt like a relic of a more naive time. The chant had evolved into something darker, something final, a promise of mutual destruction. "If they shoot, we shoot back," a voice echoed through a megaphone, the words carrying over the water. The glint of steel, legal and illegal, began to show in the crowd. This wasn't a march for civil rights. It was an invasion of the seat of power. The higher-ups had tried to divide the city, but their own brutality had welded it into a single, terrifying weapon. Chapter 6: The Downtown Siege. The march toward City Hall wasn't a parade. It was a phalanx. The organization was terrifying to the onlookers in the high-rises. On the left, construction workers from the south side in high-vis vests carried crowbars, heavy tools, and sledgehammers. On the right, young men from the west side blocks carried whatever heat they had tucked in their waistbands, their eyes locked forward. The police had set up a perimeter of concrete K-rails and armored bearcats, their snipers perched on the roofs like gargoyles. "Disperse immediately," the megaphone blared from behind the police line, but the voice sounded small against the roar of the crowd. A bottle of Grey Goose filled with gasoline and topped with a burning rag arched through the air, trailing a ribbon of fire. It shattered against the side of an armored truck, blooming into a roar of orange flame. That was the signal. The peace was officially buried under a mile of ash. A hail of bricks followed, thick enough to darken the sky. Then, the distinct, sharp crack of a 9mm rang out. A riot officer dropped, clutching his shattered thigh. The thin blue line buckled as the crowd surged forward, a human tide hitting a wall of shields. Chapter 7: The Government Bastion. Inside City Hall, the mayor was screaming into a red desk phone, his face a pale shade of grey. "Where is the National Guard? I don't care about the optics anymore. Get the governor on the line." He could hear the glass vibrating in its frames. The power of the state felt suddenly, agonizingly fragile. Outside the reinforced glass, he could see the swarm. The courtyard, once filled with tulips, manicured lawns, and fountains, was now a kill zone. The officers were pinned down behind their cruisers, trading shots with shooters hidden in the shadows of the parking garages. The higher-ups were finally feeling the walls close in, their luxury offices becoming high-altitude prisons. "They aren't stopping, sir," his security detail whispered, checking his sidearm and looking at the door. "They've cut the power to the perimeter. They're coming inside." The sounds of the heavy oak doors splintering downstairs echoed up the rotunda. The gold leaf on the ceiling didn't protect them. The marble floors didn't stop the boots. The people were in the house. Chapter 8: The Guerrilla Shift. "Flank 'em," Marcus yelled, ducking behind a marble pillar as bullets chipped away the stone near his head, sending white dust into his hair. He wasn't alone. Next to him was a guy named Miller, a white veteran who had been at the South Side meeting when Arthur was beaten. Miller knew how to move under fire. He knew that a front-to-front battle was a losing game against superior tech. "They're focused on the front gate," Miller hissed, reloading a magazine with practiced, steady fingers. "If we hit the side service entrance by the loading docks, we can get behind their line. You ready to do this, man? There's no turning back from shooting at the badge. This is life or death." Marcus looked at the blood on his knuckles and thought about Rodney's silver phone. He thought about Jerry's driveway. "They turned back from us a long time ago," Marcus said, his voice cold as ice. "Let's go." They moved through the smoke, two men from different worlds now speaking the same language of tactical necessity. Chapter 9. The Price of Ground. The street was a graveyard of burnt-out cruisers, discarded riot gear, and spent shells. The air was so thick with tear gas and smoke it felt like breathing crushed glass. 8 officers lay dead across the plaza, their uniforms no longer providing the armor of the law. Another 20 were being dragged away by their comrades, screaming in agony as the crowd pressed closer. The people were taking losses, too. The pavement was stained dark with the blood of the nameless. But for every person who fell, 3 more stepped over them, driven by a cold, vibrating adrenaline that suppressed the instinct of self-preservation. They weren't just shouting anymore. They were hunting the system that had hunted them for decades. The National Guard was still 30 minutes out, and in the world of urban combat, 30 minutes is an eternity. In those 30 minutes, the city was transformed into a territory where the higher-ups held no sway. Chapter 10. Us versus them. By midnight, the protesters had breached the lobby. The sound of shattered glass was a constant, shimmering percussion. A group of officers held the grand staircase, their barrels leveled at the crowd, their fingers twitching on triggers. Death was a heartbeat away for everyone in the room. "Stop!" An old woman's voice cut through the chaos. She stood between the guns and the mob, her small frame looking tiny against the marble. "Look at who you're shooting. That's your neighbor. That's the man who fixes your car. That's the boy who goes to school with your daughter." A captain stepped forward, his face pale and sweating under his helmet. "Get out of the way, lady. We have orders. Clear the room." "Your orders are what killed those boys," she screamed back, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Are you going to kill me too to protect a mayor who wouldn't even shake your hand?" In that moment, a realization rippled through the lobby. The uniforms were sweating. They were human, terrified, and outmanned. And for the first time, the higher-ups in the offices above knew they couldn't hide behind a badge forever. The shield was failing. Chapter 11. The Iron Heel. The arrival of the National Guard changed the sound of the city. The chaotic pops of handguns were replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors and the grinding of armored treads on asphalt. They didn't roll in with sirens. They rolled in with a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the chests of everyone downtown. 5 columns of Humvees turned onto Main Street, their mounted machine guns swiveling, looking for targets. "Move or be moved," a voice boomed from an LRAD, a sound so sharp it made people drop to their knees, clutching their ears as their vision blurred. The crowd didn't scatter immediately. A group of shooters on a rooftop opened fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night like strobes. The response from the guard was a wall of lead that tore into the brickwork, sending red dust raining down. The government had finally brought the hammer down, but the people weren't nails anymore. They were the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. The fight was no longer about a neighborhood. It was about who owned the air itself. Chapter 12. The Alleyway Pact. Marcus and Miller were pinned in a narrow alley behind a dumpster, the air whistling with ricochets that sparked against the metal. They weren't alone. A dozen people, some in hoodies, some in tactical gear they'd scavenged from fallen officers, were huddled together. The heat from the fires nearby was intense. "The guard is cutting off the exits," Miller said, checking his last magazine. "If we stay here, we're dead or in a cage for the rest of our lives. They're doing a sweep." "Then we don't stay here," Marcus replied, spitting blood from a split lip. He looked at the group. It was the first time he'd seen it so clearly. The lines were gone. "You see that? We got people from the projects and people from the suburbs bleeding on the same concrete. They thought they could play us against each other, like they always do. But look at them. They're scared because we're finally standing as one. They realized that their strength didn't come from their guns, but from the fact that them had no more shadows to hide in." Chapter 13. The High-Rise Shadow. The higher-ups, the senators, the donors, the precinct commanders, were watching from the top floors of the secure buildings, clutching glasses of scotch with trembling hands. They watched the infrared feeds from the drones. To them, the people looked like heat signatures, little green blobs being suppressed by larger white blocks of soldiers. They were disconnected, viewing the war as a data point. "How did it get this far?" a councilman asked, his voice shaking as he watched a Humvee burn. "Because you thought a check and a sanitized press conference would fix a dead kid," a voice said from the door. It was an officer, his uniform torn, his badge missing. He looked at his bosses with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You sent us out there to be a wall between you and the truth, and then you acted surprised when the wave finally hit us. We're losing men out there for your ego and your optics." He threw his belt on the floor and walked out. Chapter 14. The Standoff. At the intersection of 4th and Grand, a line of soldiers faced off against a line of civilians. No one was shooting yet, but the air was electric. It was a cold, terrifying silence. A young guardsman, barely 19, held his rifle with trembling hands, his eyes darting between the faces in front of him. A black woman stepped out from the crowd, her hands empty and open. She walked right up to the barrel of his gun until the cold metal touched her chest. "My son was Rodney's age," she whispered, her voice carrying in the stillness. "Is this what you joined for? To shoot a mother in her own city?" Behind her, a white man stepped up, then another. They linked arms, forming a human wall of every color and age against the camo and the steel. "It's us versus you," someone yelled. "And there are millions more of us than there are of you." The soldier's eyes filled with tears. The machine was starting to fail. Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. The order came over the guards' comms, crisp and cold. "Clear the intersection by any means necessary. Lethal force authorized." The young soldier looked at the woman. He looked at the man next to her. He looked at the thousands of camera phones held high, broadcasting his face to the entire world. He looked at his commander, then back at the mother. He lowered his rifle. Then the man next to him lowered his. One by one, the soldiers stepped back, refusing to be the executioners for a government that wouldn't even know their names if they died. The commander roared for them to hold the line, but the spell was broken. The realization that the them, in us versus them, was just a tiny group of people in expensive suits became undeniable. The shooting slowed. The fire remained, but the target had finally been identified. The war wasn't against the soldiers. It was against the architects of the misery. Chapter 16. The morning after. The sunrise didn't bring warmth. It just revealed the skeleton of a city that had been gutted by its own grief. Downtown looked like a war zone from a foreign land. The smell of burnt rubber, tear gas, and expensive office upholstery hung in the air like a shroud. Bodies, both in blue and in denim, were being loaded into ambulances in a grim, silent procession. The news cycles were frantic. Every station was playing the loop of Arthur's beating, and the moment the National Guard lowered their rifles. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. It wasn't thugs or rioters anymore. The headlines were finally using the word uprising. The president had gone silent, holed up in the Oval Office, as the polls showed a country that had finally seen too much. The higher-ups were beginning to realize that you can't govern a graveyard. Chapter 17. The Tactical Ceasefire. A tentative, fragile silence settled over the streets. It wasn't peace, it was a standoff. The police had retreated to their fortified precincts, and the National Guard remained in their motor pools, refusing to engage unless fired upon. The people held the streets. They owned the asphalt. Marcus, Miller, and a few others met in the shell of a Starbucks. The glass was gone, and the floor was covered in debris and dried blood. "They're waiting for us to start looting so they can come back in swinging and call it law and order," Miller said, cleaning a shrapnel wound on his arm. "We need to show them we aren't a mob. We're a movement. We need a summit. We need everyone who's left to see what we've built in the blood of our neighbors." They realized the next phase was harder than the fighting. They had to build something better than what they had destroyed. Chapter 18. The higher UPS crumble. The mayor resigned at noon. In a shaky video shot from an undisclosed location, he blamed unforeseen systemic failures. But everyone knew the truth. He was terrified for his life. The police chief followed an hour later, leaving his badge on an empty desk. The 7 officers involved in the deaths of Rodney and Jerry were officially processed into the county jail, not as heroes with paid leave, but as defendants. But the people didn't go home. The legal way had failed too many times before to be trusted again so easily. They wanted to see the foundations change, not just the faces in the windows. They began organizing a meeting in the very plaza where the 8 officers had fallen. It was to be a meeting of the survivors, a trial of the system itself. Chapter 19. The Gathering of the Tribes. They came from the suburbs in SUVs and four-wheelers, the chrome reflecting the afternoon sun. They came from the projects in cargo vans and on dirt bikes, the engines revving in a rhythmic roar. They came with bandages on their heads and fire in their eyes, but their hands were open. The white community and the black community weren't separate columns anymore. They were a singular, bruised mass of humanity. The police watched from the rooftops with binoculars, their fingers twitching on their triggers, but they were paralyzed. The sheer scale of the unity was a weapon they didn't know how to fight. You can't tear gas an entire population when they've decided they aren't afraid of the sting anymore. You can't shoot your way out of a problem when the target is everyone. Chapter 20. The Old Man's Arrival. In the center of the plaza, a makeshift stage was built out of shipping pallets and charred wood. People were shouting, arguing about what to demand first: defunding, restructuring, or a total overhaul of the city charter. The energy was vibrating, ready to snap back into violence at any second. It was a moment on a knife's edge. Then, an old man stepped up. He walked with a cane that clicked against the pavement, his face a map of decades of struggle and survival. He wore a faded suit, and his eyes were clear and sharp, despite the smoke still lingering in the air. The crowd began to hush, the respect for his age cutting through the adrenaline of the youth. This was the man who had seen the dogs and the hoses in the 60s, and he was looking at a world he never thought he'd live to see. Chapter 21. The Pallet Pulpit. The old man's name was Elijah. He leaned heavily on his cane as he climbed the shipping pallets, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked out at the sea of faces. Young men with tactical vests over hoodies, women holding pictures of Rodney and Jerry, and white families who had stood in the line of fire for the first time in their lives. "I've lived in this city for 82 years, Elijah began, his voice gravelly but carrying across the hushed crowd with the weight of thunder. "I've seen this street burn 3 times before, but every time it burned, it was just us. Just the black folks, screaming into a vacuum while the rest of the world watched on the evening news like it was a goddamn movie." He paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. This time was different. This time, the silence was broken by everyone. Chapter 22. The Ancestor's Ghost. Elijah looked at a group of young white men in the front row, their clothes stained with the same soot and blood as the kids from the projects. "I spent my youth getting my head cracked open by people who looked just like you," he said, pointing a gnarled finger at them. "I thought I'd go to my grave believing that white folks would always be the boot on our necks." He let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. "I thought I'd never see this in a million years. White and black people sticking together, shooting back at the same devil. You're some crazy motherfuckers, and I love every bit of it." The crowd rippled with a nervous, cathartic energy. "I can tell you right now, some of our ancestors are up there proud as hell. And some of yours? They're rolling in their graves, screaming about nigger lovers. Good. Let 'em roll until they hit the bottom of hell." Chapter 23. The Laughter of the Damned. For the first time in 48 hours, the tension snapped, not into violence, but into a roar of laughter. It was the laughter of people who had survived a nightmare and realized they were still standing. The absurdity of the situation hit home. The system had tried to use race to keep them divided for centuries, but the shared experience of being under the thumb of the higher-ups had forged something indestructible in the fire. "They want us to go back to our corners," Elijah shouted over the noise, his voice rising. "They want the black community, over here, and the white community, over there, so they can pick us off one by one and keep their power. But look at you. You're a goddamn mess of colors and creeds, and that is the only thing that scares the people in those high-rise offices. Your unity is their death knell." Chapter 24. The Cost of Normal. As the sun climbed higher, the higher-ups began to emerge from their holes. Negotiators from the state capitol arrived, not with riot shields, but with clipboards and promises of radical reform. The 7 officers were officially indicted on first-degree murder charges, no longer protected by the unions. The city began the slow, painful process of sweeping up the glass and towing away the charred remains of the old world. The normal that returned wasn't the same normal that had existed before Rodney and Jerry were killed. The police cruisers moved slower now, the officers inside looking at the streets with a newfound, trembling respect. They knew now that the people weren't just targets or statistics. They were a force that could dismantle a city in a single night if pushed too far. The balance of power had shifted from the office to the sidewalk. Chapter 25, The New Watch. Marcus and Miller stood on the corner, where the first shot had been fired. A small memorial of flowers, candles, and a silver cell phone marked the spot for Rodney McKnight. They didn't shake hands. They just nodded at each other, a silent pact between two men who had seen the worst of humanity and the best of it in the same breath. The city went back to work, but the walls were covered in new murals, not of peace signs, but of the people standing together against the armored trucks. The us versus them mentality remained, but us was finally everyone who lived on the ground. The higher-ups stayed in their offices, watching the streets with a lingering fear, knowing that the peace was only as strong as the justice they provided. The city was quiet, but it was a quiet that carried a warning. Don't make us do it again. Epilogue, the verdict of the streets. The county jail was a fortress within a fortress, a monolith of concrete and rebar that seemed to groan under the weight of the city's gaze. Inside, the 7 officers, the ones who pulled the triggers on Rodney and Jerry, and the ones who stood by and watched, were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, sequestered in high-security wings for their own protection. They sat in itchy orange jumpsuits, stripped of their silver badges, their spit-shined boots, and the bravado that had once made them feel untouchable. Outside those thick, windowless walls, the low, persistent rumble of thousands of four-wheelers and dirt bikes acted as a rhythmic, mechanical reminder. The city was not going home until the ledger was settled. The higher UPS, in the legal system, tried every trick in the book to stall. They filed motions to move the trial to a quieter county 3 hours away, claiming a fair jury was an impossibility in a city that had tasted smoke and revolution. But Miller and Marcus, backed by a phalanx of elite lawyers who had walked out of their high-rise corporate firms to join the US, blocked every move. "You killed them here," Marcus told the crush of news cameras on the courthouse steps, his voice echoing through the plaza. "You'll face the music here. There isn't a corner of this earth where the truth hasn't reached, but this dirt is where the debt began." The world was watching, and for the first time in history, the blue wall of silence hadn't just cracked. It had been breached by the sheer, unified weight of the people. The trial began under a sky of heavy, oppressive grey clouds that threatened to break. The prosecution didn't lead with expert testimony or complex jargon designed to confuse. They led with Rodney's silver phone. When the video played on the giant monitors, the courtroom was so silent you could hear the faint mechanical whir of the air conditioning. The jurors, 6 black, 6 white, sat like statues. They watched the shaky, handheld footage of a silver phone being pulled out as a witness to history, followed by the deafening, final crack of the shots. They saw the light leave Rodney's eyes in high definition, a digital ghost demanding justice. Then came the footage from the south side. They saw Jerry Geeks, a man whose only crime was finishing a hard day's work, executed in his own driveway because of the color of his hoodie. The defense tried to lean on the old scripts, perceived threat, split-second decisions, and officer safety, but the narrative had shifted fundamentally. The us in the gallery didn't look like a mob. They looked like a mourning family, stoic and immovable. Every time the defense tried to justify the violence, Miller would catch the eyes of the officers. He didn't have to say a word. His presence, and the thousands of people standing in a silent vigil outside the courthouse doors, said it all. The old excuses were dead and buried. The jury didn't take days to deliberate. They didn't even take an afternoon. They took 4 hours. When the lead juror, a middle-aged white woman from the south side, stood to read the verdict, her voice didn't waver a single decibel. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of civil rights violations. Guilty. 7 times for 7 men. As the judge prepared to hand down the sentences, the room held its collective breath. For the 3 officers who had stood by, failing in their duty to intervene, the hammer fell with a weight they never expected. 70 to 75 years each in a maximum security facility. Then, the judge turned to the 4 who had pulled the triggers. Her voice was cold as stone as she delivered the final blow. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the metallic sound was broadcast through the outdoor speakers to the crowd. A roar went up that was heard 5 miles away. Not a roar of hate, but a roar of profound relief. Inside the courtroom, the high UPS, the union heads and the remaining councilmen, sat with their heads in their hands, their power evaporated. As the officers were led away to the transport vans, they had to pass through a corridor of the very people they had once patrolled with iron fists. There were no stones thrown this time. No one reached out to strike them. There was only a sea of silent, steady gazes. The debt was being paid in years, in decades, and in lifetimes. The city was moving forward, finally walking on its own 2 feet.